After 2 grueling years of waiting, Elden Ring is finally here. Jack and I both had initial misgivings about the new open world direction they took, but were thrilled to be proven wrong when we discovered this is quite possibly From Software's finest work, or at least toe-to-toe with their other masterpieces. Before we get too deep into things, we'd both like to apologize for the long gap between uploads and thank you all for the recent surge of support. Between our last upload and now, we've more than doubled in subscribers and racked up an insane amount of views across the board, which is awesome. As for why we took so long, Elden Ring is just a massive game with a catalog of a whopping 113 bosses, and we wanted to be certain we had every last one down for the count before making this video. I grinded so hard that I had the platinum before most people even beat their second shard bearer. In case you didn't notice, this is going to be a 4-part series because we're not just counting the big guys, but everybody in our ranking.
That being said, we made exceptions for bosses that were more or less identical to another one, but overall we were pretty generous in what qualifies as a boss in our opinion. If you're looking for a comprehensive examination of even the most pointless and irrelevant creatures in the lands between, this is the channel for you. Keep in mind that Alex and I, more than ever before, have widely differing opinions since we found bosses at different times and used different builds, me with Dex and him strength. And with the large amount of generic shaft to sift through, some of our rankings are admittedly a tad arbitrary. Are we willing to die on the hill that the Black Knife Assassin is worse than the Cleanrot Knight? Not really, we barely give two shits. But for what it's worth, we genuinely tried to make it as accurate as possible with respect to our joint thoughts, and hope you enjoy what we have to say regardless. With that lengthy intro out of the way, let's get into the bottom quadrant of Elden Ring's bosses.
This is a first for us, a 2-way segment. Wait, I think we did this in our Dark Souls 3 video or whatever. Anyways, I feel it's necessary for Jack to come on here and explain why he thinks Commander Nyal is the worst of the lot, since between us he's the one with a far greater bone to pick. And if you were wondering why the Alex and Jack rating on the slide is absent for this video, it's because it'd take forever and not really be worth doing here. Over and out.
In a series where poison lakes, and poison pools, and poison gas, and, well, poison everything has not only gone from obnoxious mechanic to beloved staple of every title, we've finally hit the point where a legitimate catalog of bosses feature Toxic, in this game known as Scarlet Rot, as their main mechanic. While fans adoring cesspools of bugs and constant health depletion is more of an inside joke than, say, something the community actually finds enjoyable, bosses with poison are utterly miserable. Enter the Putrid Avatar, like a Dementor sucking away any and all fun to be had with Elden Ring's top-class combat. Scarlet Rot is similar to Frostbite from Dark Souls 3 in that, while in the vicinity of the cloud/after effect of an elemental attack, you take constant damage equivalent to an internal hemorrhage. With a minuscule arena and only a select number of moves, this miscarried avatar will do more damage to you at level 158 than you will to him, which relative to the majority of the mini-bosses in this game is simply ridiculous. We like to save mechanical evaluation for the actual boss over rehashes and so on. However, a fight so bad it comes close to rivaling the Bed of Chaos is truly a marvel deserving of hate-fueled attention.
If there's one thing I hate, it's spazzy bosses who love to make distance from you. This is one of my and many other people's biggest pet peeves in gaming, but clearly this memo is yet to make its way to FromSoft HQ. The senior Falling Star Beast isn't helped by its insane amount of defense and brutal output either. There's also a cliff on every side of the arena, which Dragon righted me more times than I care to admit thanks to the ridiculous knockback many of the beast attacks have. As cool as it looks, the Falling Star Beast is such a relentless, violent pain in the ass that it managed to fumble all the way down to the murky bottoms of our ranking.
what? I'd like to think this placement is a shock to, well, absolutely nobody. The base tree spirit is a horrifying and even more horribly designed mini-boss that shows up way too many times to begin with, and if you do the algebra, mix an already subpar enemy with toxic damage, and you get a god-awful mess. While I do truly appreciate the sheer scale of Elden Ring's boss list, some were probably better off left in the think tank.
More or less the same as his senior, but with a less unorthodox arena and a health bar that takes less than an eon to shave down. Still an annoying bastard of a boss, but I'll take this one over the Elder any day.
Admittedly, I'm the main perpetrator behind decaying X-Ike's F-grade placement, but there's no denying that reskinning a flying dragon white and slapping on Toxic for kicks is deserving of anything better. With the main point of attack being the X-Ike's feet, and him promptly shooting out a mushroom cloud of scarlet rot with each ensuing stomp, preventing you from hitting his feet, repetition starts to seep through almost immediately. As well, the arena bugs him out, and after fighting and basically dying to him on my first trip to Caelid in the early game, he just wasn't there until after I beat Morgott. I am a fan of dragon fights when fought at a proper level, however, one making use of the game's worst mechanic isn't exactly a recipe for success.
Is he anywhere near as bad as his putrid counterpart? Not really. In this form, he never features ridiculous battle stats, so the fight isn't particularly grueling. That isn't to say the enemy itself is well designed or anything of that sort, however. I originally had this fight in the upper middle portion of my list because I thought it had funny movement and I never died to it, so my thinking wasn't yet tinted by anger. It was only when I saw the horrors a cracked out endgame level stats Tree Spirit could do while getting the Erdtree Favors +2 talisman that I began to grasp how irritating it is when you have to put actual effort into fighting it.
With 113 technically unique boss fights, gimmicks are somewhat of a necessity to keep things fresh. But to ask the question, why are FromSoft's gimmicks so unbearably dreadful? In an unfair comparison, look at any given mainline Mario or Zelda title and just watch a random boss, or even mini-boss for that matter. These bosses all feature unique mechanics that aren't exceptionally aggravating or created around hindering a core gameplay mechanic. Take notes, and also making the thing from the Fantastic Four into a boss doesn't help the argument either way. This is the first time of many on this list where the discrepancies in Alex's strength build and my dex build come into play. With dexterity, fast-paced, high-damage combos are the only way to go in combat, while strength builds rarely, if never, can pull off more than 2 to 3 hits without facing counterattacks and instead dish out damage in individual hits. So, with both strength and dex being limited to 1 R1 per offensive on the Stone Digger Troll, doing 300 to 400 damage versus a measly give or take about 100 absolutely changes perspective on the fight overall. It is just not fun getting tossed around like I'm in a bouncy house due to the Troll's gigantic AoE radius, double due to dex builds having basically no form of retaliation. Fighting a boss you can't fight isn't a great idea for a fight.
You know a boss is horrible when it has awesome looking red lightning and I still hate it. The first phase is inoffensive enough and lulls you into a false sense of security, but the bullshit dial gets cranked to 11 when he gets the lightning strike move. No one I have ever met online or in person has found a way to dodge this thing consistently, and it instantly decommissions you unless you have unholy gobs of vigor going into it. It's a lot like Nito's spear dildo attack if it had godly tracking, came from the sky, and killed you every time. The only way I found to combat this was to stand around him and bait the far more manageable close-range version of this move. I don't really have any more objective reasoning for why I hate this boss, I just know that seeing it always fills me with anger and dread at the same time. At least the ground stomp weapon art practically stun locks him if you have that handy.
From overexposure, I can handle an individual Kindred of Rot as well as anything this game throws my way. 2.
Makes me in my drawers.
Celia Crystal Tunnel should serve as a grand introduction to the true depths of terrible enemy design that are the Kindreds of Rot, although 2 in a confined space is actually far more manageable than expected. Getting down the timing of the arrows is satisfying only due to how obnoxious and high damage that attack is normally, but if neither utilize this mechanic much, the fight is truly a breeze. Just a tip, don't fight any non-Limgrave mini-boss until you're heinously overpowered, or you will suffer the consequences. Cheerio.
First off, who the hell even found this thing? An illusory staircase you find by jumping. Get the hell out of here. The grand reward for your neurotic illusory wall hunt is a face-off with the One Reborn's weaker teleporting cousin. I would be more angry if this thing had enough health to pose an actual threat, but as is, it feels more like crushing an ugly bug with a paper towel or something. Unpleasant and surprising, but not likely to cause you much trouble.
Agheel is pretty awesome unless his stats are set for New Game++ in base New Game and is restricted to a bridge the size of his fire breath. Grail is one of those bosses you fight once and never come back to, although in my case I somehow managed to beat this thing, the Beast Clergyman, and the Blackblade Kindred severely underleveled in a single run because I didn't know there was a Grey Site right next to Grail's bridge but lucked out anyways, and I'm also exceptionally good at this game. For the record, knocking out 25% of this thing's health bar while one-shot is historic.
I'm normally the sort of guy who feels bad about killing animals in video games, but my sympathy went out the window within the first 10 seconds of this wretched bout. The Rune Bear is just a health bar possessing rehash of one of the most frustrating overworld enemies I've ever encountered since Cazadors in Fallout New Vegas. When it isn't throwing a spastic fit and lurching around the room at random, the Rune Bear is pawing at his side and preventing you from comfortably flanking him, reducing your countering windows to the minute breaks in action where it isn't swinging like a madman. This is one creature that deserves to go extinct.
Instant death is like Curse from previous Souls titles if it got its nuts removed, and for that alone it is leagues above the real-life misery caused by Scarlet Rot. Wormface is a garbage enemy and a rare case of a Bloodborne-inspired boss I have no idea how to handle. I find it best to carefully pick and choose swing openings, or otherwise you will be face-deep in a raging storm of ridiculously fast build-up Curse. If you bait Wormface into utilizing his physical attacks over Deathblight Storms, then this should prove to be little more than a pushover. Unless he doesn't, in which case you are screwed.
Did you like the PvP in Dark Souls 1? I actually did, to be honest, but this was a little much even for me. This one-sided backstab fest actively punishes you for thoughtful play and rewards mindless spam, which is a really odd and probably unintentional design choice. Yes, you can watch the water on the floor and try to swing at the perfect time to nab a hit or two on him, or you can just mash R1 with a greatsword and wait for him to stumble into it like a moron with no risk whatsoever. You'll never guess what I opted for. This guy is lucky he managed to just barely crawl his way up to a double-digit rank.
I think there's a trend going on here, or otherwise it just happens to be that about every single boss so far has their main source of damage by way of irritating elemental abilities. While surely the flashiest boss so far, the Sanguine Noble's extravagant flair only goes as far as visual enjoyment, if that. Her blood pool prevents quick escape through fat rolls and slowed movement, although the rest of her moveset is a random mesh of swipes and occasional blood magic other enemies and even mini-bosses share as well. As one of many servants of the Lord of Blood, the Sanguine Noble is at best forgettable and at worst a prime example of soul shithousery.
I'm almost glad this boss exists. No FromSoft title is truly complete unless it houses at least one boss that I despise with all my being. This is my pick for worst boss in the game. For a while I was worried Elden Ring would be nothing but quality showings, but at the tail end of the Sayophra Aqueduct, these two gentlemen decided to set things straight. It wasn't hatred at first sight. I was neutral on it initially when it was just the one gargoyle. It was only when Thing 2 decided to toss his ugly mug into the mix that I knew I was in for a shitstorm. As my countless deaths piled up and the clock ticked on, I slowly came to realize that this fight is one of the most reprehensible, rotten things I've ever had the misfortune of experiencing. This is literally the video game equivalent of a giant jug full of bile and horse piss being sprayed out of a hose down your esophagus. The poison breath coming from off screen is always a joy, but far worse is their tendency to retreat away from you in those wonky hitboxes. There must have been a million times where I swung at them from almost point-blank range, only to inexplicably miss. This was roughly the point where I began to get a sneaking suspicion that strength builds were useless garbage, an ugly truth that would haunt me for the rest of my playthrough and the subsequent runs. I won't grace this abomination with any more screen time, but know that the only valiant thing about them is the effort it must have taken to make something this miserable. Eat shit, you fucks.
To be fair, I quite enjoy fighting the many Erdtree avatars found throughout the game. While on the surface only seeming to be a late game padded repaste of the previous encounters, at 50% health the avatar actually splits in two like it just went through mitosis or something, I don't know. And it goes from muscle memory therapy to a legitimately hard fight. They share a health bar, so the strategy is just sticking with the one you've been going for up to that point. However, due to the very slim number of true ganks in this game, I found it surprisingly hard to manage. So hard, in fact, I died. And this is why it hovers in the same region as the tapeworms, as well as every other second-rate boss up to this point. I'll speed it up so you don't have to sit through 4 minutes of nothing at all, but I think I've made my point. With no Stake of Marika and late to endgame damage output, the mountaintops of the Giant's Erdtree avatar is a failure, totally preventable.
I can't even trash on this boss too hard. It's literally just a stationary flower that comes poison and uses a neutered version of a Call Beyond. This move seems to miss me no matter what I do every time, so there's nothing really stopping me from just hacking it into salad at point blank range. Next.
As one of the most daunting enemies in the entire game, I can imagine the nightmarish difficulty that had come with fighting the Guardian Golem at Limgrave stats. Logically, FromSoft chose the melee variant over the bow and arrow variant, however, the frustration that comes along with these guys is exponential in a tight arena versus open fields, not to mention enhanced health and damage fit for a mini-boss. Luckily for me, and apparently many others, I had no idea High Road Cave existed until well after I beat the Elden Beast, so basically all of these points are hypotheticals, but it's bad enough for me to envision the frustration even at about 100 levels over the intended amount.
Our friend Commander Niall seems to have a comrade in arms, although fortunately this guy is nowhere near as frustrating as his associate. His name is amusingly out of place. You have this world where everyone is called some shit like Asgoth, Harbinger of Oblivion, and then there's just some Irish dude. Not quite as horrifying as the British person-filled world of Bloodborne, but odd nonetheless. Scarlet Rot AoE damage is a real barrel of fun, but that's to be expected of anything found in Caelid, which is basically the O block of the lands between. Jump attacks and other poise-shattering techniques will have him on his knees in no time and ready for a riposte. Simple as.
He's a pyromancer with one neat attack. I think it's ridiculous that entire boss fights can be locked due to simply not following a questline, that being Ranni's, and the creative choice to do so makes the fight even less rewarding, seeing as it's about as secret as mini-bosses come.
At number 91, we have, shocker, more Chalice Dungeon tier fodder. I killed this thing in like 2 moves or something, and even in that short window I was convinced it was a dud boss fight. At least he looks sorta neat.
In Bloodborne, the grafted Scion, similar to the Royal Revenant, would likely be at least somewhat enjoyable versus frustrating and hard for that reason alone. This thing is just another example of From Software making extremely volatile enemies who can hit you from any angle, with any limb, and movesets made around preventing offense in any possible scenario. I'm a fan if the enemies are balanced, but as the first boss in the game, it's like a more frustrating Vanguard from Demon's Souls minus the atmosphere. New Game Plus finally gives you fairgrounds to fight, but the satisfaction of beating the grafted Scion with base stats rivals the likes of Melania and, well, no, not the Orphan of Kos, but you feel like UMBC beating Virginia.
Literally just an NPC with a health bar. Not much substance to this besides the cool lightning magic. He's not unpleasant or anything, but he doesn't do much to stand out. Prime example of the pleasant but pointless chaff this game is so heavily populated with.
With his expected return, Patches makes his grandest introduction yet by way of a pseudo boss fight. Featuring peanut butter breath and the usual spear and shield, he'll fight you until you bitch him and gives in. I personally recommend keeping him alive and not opening the warp chest because he sells Stone's Eared keys for deflated prices, but he's also a shithead, so do whatever. Mercy is a sign of weakness.
I'm not gonna lie, hacking these guys down with the battle axe weapon art was one of the most fun moments of my entire playthrough. Does that make this a good boss? Not really, but giving them low poise was definitely a stroke of genius. This is the first of many bosses to come that I ranked almost solely on how fun they were to beat up, with these guys placing lower in the totem pole because they start off in a room full of goons that demand your attention first. Once you get some quality alone time with them though, things get better.
I am no fan of the Capra Demon, but a modern remix I can absolutely vouch for. As one of the most obscurely hidden mini-bosses in the game, it was a surprise in itself to just find a boss at the back end of the Albernautic Village, even more so one of the most hated bosses in the Souls series. The dogs aren't exactly necessary, but the fire and Artorias-esque flips make for a really fresh take on one of FromSoft's most stale creations. The Omen Killer is a good boss, in my opinion, but suffers from the nature of different opinions and thus lands a spot in the back end of our list.
This pairing is carried hard by the warrior. As soon as it's down for the count, things go decidedly south for the perfumer, which, makes sense. I don't know how the I'd kill someone with perfume either. It's funny watching the perfumer's health bar get hacked down in one attack, so it gets brownie points for that. An easy but harmless encounter that I have no strong feelings towards one way or another.
Thank you so much for watching the first of our 4-part series ranking Elden Ring's bosses from worst to best. As quantitatively the longest video, featuring 29 bosses, parts 2, 3, and 4 will feature 28 per, although that isn't to say it'll be any less opinionated. With so many bosses, it's only natural the vast majority will fail to meet expectations. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't, and otherwise be on the lookout for the rest of the Elden Ring series. Once again, thanks so much for watching, and with that said, deuces.